Let us discuss hockey's future. Yes, and so I'm hoping to be able to do news of the day type videos discussing all the other leagues, getting into the European leagues as well as the plan as the NHL wraps up their season. So we are, in the midst of seeing the European leagues make their return. There's some interesting news from the KHL over the last few weeks, which I've discussed previously. But let's start with juniors in Canada, where you get a lot of prospects for the draft, right? And this is where they develop. And it is in the NHL's best interests to see that these prospects still develop and what's going to happen. So the QMJHL, we'll start with Quebec. Mostly Quebec Maritimes is in there as well. Starts this Friday. And it's a 60-game season. They've actually changed it, so now there's 3 6-team divisions. You will only play teams in your own division. This gets around the travel restrictions that we see in the Maritimes within Canada. And that's going to be interesting to see how that goes. Fans in attendance, not to start with. Imports, of course, due to travel restrictions from outside of Canada, they will not start the season in the QMJHL. We'll see if the restrictions get changed at some point. And there's been some discussion about Canada easing some border restrictions, not completely, but some sort of easing of restrictions. And you have to think that at some point these players will be allowed to come over and play. There are rumors that there's $16 million in pandemic relief that was given by the Quebec provincial government that may be on the line if the QMJHL doesn't take stricter penalties into effect against fighting, which the QMJHL denies. Says, no, that's not a thing. So we'll see, because without $16 million in pandemic relief, you have to think the Q probably doesn't play. And this is where, for people who say, the NHL is trying to get rid of fighting, it's not the NHL. And if it gets out of the junior leagues, you're ending up in a really, really interesting position when guys are coming up through the pro leagues as to how that's going to work. Because if they don't learn how to fight, and it is a skill in and of itself. You don't learn how to fight in the Q, in the OHL, in the WHL. Oh, man, once you get up with the pros. They're denying that that's a thing, but it's out there. So I'll throw this into this video, and you guys can let me know what you think of that. The OHL training camps are set for November 15th. So their training camps are still a month and a half away at the soonest. 64-game schedule is planned with a 16-team playoffs. December 1st is the planned start date. So November 15th training camps, December 1st start date. But there's teams in the OHL that play on the American side of the border, and that needs to be resolved. This is, again, where the NHL will pay a lot of attention to it and maybe throw a lawyer or two into it. Maybe the NHL throws some money at getting this figured out for the OHL so that they're able to figure it out for themselves as well. Because it's the same idea, right? Where players are going to be crossing the border to play. And how's that going to work? Do the American OHL teams end up playing in Canada? It's not as easy either. Because for the OHL, that's a pretty big headache. And of course, for the juniors, not having fans in attendance is more than just a headache. That's potentially a deal breaker. So we'll see how that gets worked out for the OHL. And related, the Ice Dogs were advertising that they needed billet families. So for these junior players, they very often will live away from home. And so when they're living away from home, they have a billet family they stay with. So if you've watched Letterkenny and you're not up on the vernacular and you're like, so when they talk about a billet sister and a rocket, what are they talking about? Okay, I won't talk about rockets, but billet sister would be that you're with a billet family and you're uncomfortable because the billet family has a daughter that you find attractive, but you don't want to get kicked out of the house and all that. So billets, they're the family you stay with. They make an amount of money for taking the player in, and they make sure the player's going to school, that the player's fed, and all these other wonderful things that you do when somebody's in your family. And it's supposed to be something that's good for both the families and the player. But during a pandemic, there will be families who normally would be billet families that say, I think I'm going to just say no this year. And so it makes sense that once all these leagues are up and running, there are going to be calls for teams needing billet families to stay with. Speaking of which, the WHL, they haven't really announced anything yet because they're not sure what's going on. So they're hoping for a 68-game schedule starting December 4th. That's the hope. The problem is they need fans to break even on one side, or They need some help from the government. And here in BC, our premier made a boneheaded decision to call an election. So he did that last week, and the collective reaction from everybody in BC has been, what? You're calling an election? He doesn't need to. He didn't need to. There was no need to call an election, but he did. So he did, and I'm not particularly impressed with it. I understand what he's trying to do. So in BC, just a little bit of a lesson. We have a legislature which has, you have your NDP, you have your Liberal, and then you have a couple of Green seats, and you have a couple of independents. So what's been going on is that because he doesn't have a majority of the seats, John Horgan, the premier in BC, has been working across the aisle with the Greens so that they form a coalition that then has enough votes to get everything passed through the House when they need it to, right? Through the legislature. And he doesn't want to have to keep working with them. He wants to have a majority government. During the pandemic, his ratings have gone through the roof. His overall ratings have been very, very high. So he's looking at that and saying, my ratings are really high. If I call an election right now, I can get the majority I need, and then I don't have to work with anybody. And my problem with that is, what are you trying to get done that you can't get done with other people? What are you trying to get done? So because it's a snap election and it's in Canada, it's going to happen in a month. So it's within a month of the election being called, you have an election. Yeah, the idea of elections running for years doesn't happen in Canada. So the reason I mention it here is because that throws the entire WHL season into chaos. They want the go-ahead from the BC government. The BC government right now, the last thing that they're thinking about is the WHL and junior hockey in British Columbia. So unless he does it as like a stunt for the election, there isn't really much that they can do. And of course, BC health officials have to be in on it too. So even if John Horgan goes, all right, sure, go ahead and play, we may get health officials saying, well, wait a minute, we need to have regulations in place and everything. So it's all up in the air. And so for some of these junior teams, we don't know what's going on. And it'll be the same for the BCHL, for the lower down leagues as well. And it's just all kind of, they're hoping. But with the BC election, that kind of throws everything into chaos because for the next almost a month, we don't have any idea what's going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if the Liberals win the election, to be honest. I wouldn't be surprised if, because elections in Canada can be really weird that way, that all of a sudden there's this massive turn and it ends up being completely different than what you think. I've seen before where somebody will call an election looking for a majority so that they have all the control, and it backfires. And this is one of those situations where it could very well backfire because most people don't think that there needs to be an election. So there's definitely some risk to that. ECHL. So getting back into the professional side of hockey, but lower leagues, the ECHL teams are signing players. This I think is key because this means that the ECHL is planning on playing this season. They're hopeful to start December 4th. But the thing is this. So the ECHL is the lower league below the AHL. The AHL is looking at December 4th as well, if it's feasible. So I don't know what happens if the AHL says, we can't make this work. We can't come back December 4th. We don't think this is going to work. Can the ECHL exist without the AHL? Do NHL teams looking to get guys development time who we don't want to see in junior hockey because they're too old, or maybe they feel like, okay, well, we don't have to put them down there. Do you send them to the ECHL or do you send them to Europe? So it's going to be interesting to see. Whatever decision the AHL makes is going to have a huge influence on how things turn out for the ECHL. But as recently as 2 days ago, I'm still seeing articles on ECHL teams signing players. And for the record, AHL teams have been signing players as well. Cody Franzen signing with an AHL team as a for instance, a player that people should know. So these leagues are tied to one another, and I don't know that you can have one without the other. Can the AHL exist without the ECHL is also a valid question. You're going to have guys in the AHL that need to be developed that aren't getting the ice time in the AHL. You may not have anywhere to send them unless there's some kind of an agreement to send them over to Europe. But if they're ECHL level, where would they play in Europe, and would it benefit at all to sending them to Europe? There's a lot of details yet to be ironed out in this. NHL teams are still loaning players to the KHL. I'm honestly a little bit surprised. The KHL has had no mitigation over COVID at all. They're at this point just, yeah, well, all right, go play. Yeah, they're all going to get sick. Whatever. And so there are a lot of players who have fallen ill. And so we're seeing like over half of rosters out at the same time. And this is something with the NHL. This is why they're doing the testing, and they had bubbles for this. Because once it gets into the locker room, well, lots of players are going to get it. And you know, it is something that can take weeks to work through. So you may be down for a week, you may be down for two. Yes, there are players who will only be down for a day or two and they bounce right back. But there will be players who are down for weeks with this. So, you know, the NHL still loaning players to the KHL. I'm honestly kind of surprised that NHL teams are doing that. I mean, I get it. These guys need to play hockey. But, again, when you have a league that's just that cavalier, it's a bold strategy. See how it pays off for them, to quote Dodgeball and all of that. But, yeah. And does that state something about how the NHL approaches next year? God, I hope not. Anyways, and last but not least, the NCAA. Their season's delayed, which makes sense. NCAA, a couple of the different football conferences have said, thanks, no thanks, we're not playing this year. There are football conferences that are playing. And so it does not surprise me that the NCAA hockey, which of course in the U.S. NCAA system, hockey's down here, football's, you know, it's in the grand scheme of things, NCAA football makes about as much money as the NFL. So, and you don't have to pay the players, so it's gravy. But not that they don't make some money here and there. But that's a whole other discussion for another time. But NCAA hockey, not as lucrative, clearly. And not as lucrative to the league or to the players playing it. So we're seeing that season delayed and not a lot in the way of updates. I wouldn't be surprised if the season's canceled for some of these programs. There may be some that find a way to work through this, but there's going to be some seasons, I think, that are going to get canceled. And then again, if you're a team that owns the rights to players in the NCAA and they're not playing, now what? So there's going to be a lot of interesting issues coming out of this season that we're seeing starting up when it comes to player development, both of drafted players, of players going into their draft year. If you're a 2021 draft player, this whole board is kind of a nightmare. Absolute nightmare. Because this is your year now to prove you're ready for the NHL. And if you're in the WHL, it's up in the air. Are you going to have a season? If you're in the Q, you're going to have a season starting on Friday, but you're just playing in your own division. So if you're in a weak division and you're picking up all kinds of points, scouts could go, yeah, he's pretty good, but it's against weak competition. So, and vice versa. If you're in a really tough division and you're a total sufferer as a result, you may look worse in the eyes of scouts because like, yeah, no, his numbers are terrible this year. And of course, with the OHL, the plan is December 4th, or December 1st, I should say, but we'll see. So this is all still up in the air, and I'll be here to report on whatever happens when it does. And yes, this does mean that I will keep a close eye on things going on with the other leagues, report it to you, all you fine people, because the NHL might be out for a while. So there is hockey being played. As long as there's hockey being played, this is the hockey guy. It's not the NHL guy. And this is part of the reason why people are like, oh, you should just call yourself the NHL guy. No, because I do talk about other leagues. But clearly, you know, I'm going to do videos in the direction of the NHL because that's where the most popular videos are going to be. And that's what I watch a majority of the time. And now I will be watching this hockey once it gets started up. I'll watch QMJHL games, no problem. And gladly do little reviews here and there of junior hockey games as well. And then yesterday I had the idea while I was watching football that maybe I should review one football game a week on the Entertainment Guy channel. So I may start doing that as well. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. How optimistic or pessimistic are you of which of these leagues are able to have a season and how it's going to work? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.